After reusing to help pay for my college, parents now expect me to give $150,000 for my sister's expensive wedding. So I refused them, remembering the words they said many years ago. Then sister burst into my apartment. I grew up in a small town, in a modest 2-story house with my parents, and my older sister Grace. She was just 2 years older than me, but sometimes it felt like we lived in completely different worlds. My father owned a small cafe that brought in enough to keep us comfortable, while mom stayed home and occasionally helped out at the restaurant. It wasn't a luxurious life, but we got by. Well, most of us did. Grace, sweetheart, that presentation was absolutely brilliant. I remember mom gushing one evening after a school event. You're going to go so far in life. You're just so talented. I stood in the doorway still holding my own certificate from the science fair, but nobody seemed to notice. It was always like that. Grace was the star, and I was the shadow. That was the pattern of my childhood. Grace got the latest iPhone while I inherited her old one with the cracked screen. She wore designer clothes while I got her hand-me-downs. Every family gathering became a showcase of Grace's achievements. Did you hear about Grace's SAT scores? Dad would proudly tell our relatives, top percentile. And she's president of the debate club too. I learned to fade into the background during these conversations. Knowing my straight B's and position as treasurer of the environmental club wouldn't merit a mention. It wasn't that I was doing poorly, I was doing fine. But in our house, fine might as well have been failure. Stella, mom said to me once when I was helping her fold laundry, you should really think about practical career options. Maybe something in retail or service. There's nothing wrong with honest work. The word stung, but I'd gotten used to the constant reminders of my perceived limitations. What I hadn't gotten used to was the way they seemed to actively work to reinforce them. Looking back now, I realize that those early years were setting the stage for everything that would follow. The constant comparisons, the subtle put-downs, the clear message that I was somehow less than my sister, it all left marks that would take years to heal. But sometimes the deepest wounds become the strongest motivations, and my family had no idea how their treatment would eventually come back to shape all our futures. I still remember the day Grace got her college acceptance letter. The whole house erupted in celebration. Mom made her favorite dinner. Dad brought home an expensive bottle of wine, and they spent the entire evening making plans for her future. Our brilliant girl is going to one of the best colleges in the city. Mom couldn't stop beaming. We've been saving for this moment since you were born, sweetheart. I sat quietly at the dinner table, pushing food around my plate, trying to imagine what my own celebration would be like in 2 years. I should have known better. When my turn came, the response couldn't have been more different. I'd worked hard to maintain good grades, joined clubs, and even took extra courses to boost my college applications. But none of that seemed to matter. College? Mom's laugh was sharp and dismissive when I brought up the subject. Stella, be realistic. We just can't afford to send you to. Besides, you're not really college material. But what about all the money you saved for Grace? I asked, my voice shaking. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. That was different. Grace had a clear path, exceptional grades. You're more suited for practical work. Speaking of which, I could use another waitress at the cafe. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I could work while studying, I pleaded. Please, just help me get started. We could borrow from relatives or take out a loan. I'll pay back every penny with interest. I'll even get it in writing with a lawyer. We never borrow from anyone in principle, Mom said coldly. We don't borrow money and we're not going to change our principles for you. You need to accept your limitations and find a suitable job. I spent that night crying in my room, but by morning, determination had replaced my tears. I went to the only people who had ever truly seen me, my grandparents. Grandpa, Grandma, I need your help. I explained everything through tears at their kitchen table. I can't just give up on college. I can't. Grandpa's eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. We don't have savings, sweetheart, but let me see what I can do. No grandchild of mine is going to have their dreams crushed like this. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of emotions. First, the disappointment of the bank rejecting the loan application. Then, the shocking moment when Grandpa announced he was selling their old country house and the plot of land it sat on. The sale of the property provided exactly enough for my college tuition. I applied to study investment management in a city far from home, as far as I could get from the constant reminders of my family's lack of faith in me. The day I left, Mom and Dad didn't even come to say goodbye. Only my grandparents stood at the bus station, Grandma hugging me tight while Grandpa wiped away what he tried to pretend weren't tears. From that day forward, I cut ties with my parents completely. When breaks came and I had to return to town, I stayed with my grandparents in their now smaller house. Their sacrifice meant everything to me, and every time I walked into their modest home, I was reminded of what real family support looked like. After 4 years of hard work, I finally graduated with my degree in investment management. I returned to my hometown with big dreams and a freshly printed diploma, but reality hit hard. The job market wasn't exactly welcoming to new graduates, and I spent weeks sending out applications without any promising responses. Eventually, I landed a position at a small trading company. It wasn't the prestigious investment firm I'd imagined working for, but it was a start. I found a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy, but it was mine, paid for with my own money. Then came the call I never expected. Stella? Grace's voice was sugary sweet on the phone. It's been ages. You should come over for dinner this weekend. I'd love to catch up. Something in her tone should have warned me, but I agreed. Maybe time had changed things. Maybe we could finally have a real relationship as adults. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived at Grace's house that evening, I immediately knew I'd walked into a trap. My parents were already there, along with Grace's boyfriend, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who barely acknowledged my existence. The interrogation began as soon as we sat down to eat. "So Stella," Mom started, her fork poised mid-air. "Tell us about this job of yours." "I'm working at a trading company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's small but," Grace cut in with a laugh. "Trading company? You mean like those discount stores? Honestly, you didn't need a college degree for that. Anyone could walk in off the street and get that job." Unlike Grace, Mom beamed, who's a manager at the Citibank. "And Thomas here is a lawyer with Anderson and Pierce." Grace's boyfriend nodded smugly. "Top law firm in the state. I told you college wasn't necessary for you," dear Mom sighed. "Such a waste of your grandfather's property." Dad chuckled, swirling his wine glass. "Hey, my offer still stands. I could use an educated waitress at the cafe. Think how impressed the customers would be. Would you like fries with that from someone with a college degree?" They all laughed, except me. I stared at my plate, pushing the food around just like I used to do as a child. "Where did you say you're living now?" Grace asked, though I hadn't mentioned it yet. "I found a place on Cedar Street," I replied quietly. The table erupted in theatrical gasps. "Cedar Street?" Grace's eyes widened in mock concern. "Oh, Stella, that's literally the worst neighborhood in the city." Only she paused for effect. "Well, you know, people who can't afford better live there." "Beggars, she means beggars," Mom stage whispered, and they all laughed again. Something inside me snapped. 4 years of distance hadn't changed anything. They were still the same cruel, judgmental people they'd always been. I stood up so abruptly, my chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You know what? I'd rather be a beggar than be like any of you," I spat out. "At least I got where I am on my own without riding on someone else's coattails or living off Daddy's money." I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, ignoring their protests and accusations. As I walked out into the night, I promised myself it would be the last time I ever set foot in their presence. Life has a funny way of surprising you just when you think you've hit a dead end. I was still working at the small trading company, doing my best but feeling stuck, when my phone rang one afternoon. It was Lisa, my old college roommate. "Stella, you're not going to believe this," she was practically shouting with excitement. "Remember how we always talked about working for Maxwell Investment Group? They're opening an office in your city, and they're looking for fresh talent. I already put in a good word for you." My heart started racing. Maxwell was one of the biggest names in investment management. I spent that night updating my resume, and the next week preparing for the interview. When I walked into their temporary office, I felt like everything in my life had been leading to this moment. The interview wasn't easy. They grilled me on everything from market trends to specific investment strategies. But all those extra hours I'd put in at my current job, all the additional research I'd done in my free time, it all paid off. A week later, I got the call I was in. From day one, I threw myself into the work. While others went home at 5, I stayed late, developing new investment strategies and refining my project proposals. My first major project was managing a portfolio for a mid-sized tech company. When it yielded a 40% return in the first quarter, people started noticing. "Stella, this is exceptional work," my supervisor said during my 6-month review. Along with his praise came a bonus that was larger than my entire year's salary at the previous company. But it wasn't enough. I worked harder, took on bigger projects, built a reputation for turning struggling investments into gold mines. The bonuses kept getting bigger, and I had a plan for every penny. 2 years after starting at Maxwell, I walked into a luxury car dealership. The salesman probably thought I was lost until I pointed to their top-of-the-line model and said, "I'll take that one." An hour later, I was pulling up to my grandparents' house in a gleaming new car, complete with a giant red bow on top. Grandpa's jaw dropped when I handed him the keys, but I wasn't done. The next month, I closed on a stunning apartment in the Heights, the most prestigious new development in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and a view that made you feel like you owned the whole city. I was walking out of my building one morning, coffee in hand, when I heard a familiar voice. "Stella?" Grace stood there in her designer workout gear, looking like she'd seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. "Oh, I live here," I said casually, pointing to the penthouse level of the building. "Just bought it, actually." The look on Grace's face was priceless, a mixture of disbelief, shock, and something else. For the first time in our lives, I saw envy in my perfect sister's eyes. A week after my encounter with Grace, my phone rang. Seeing my parents' number on the screen was surprising enough. They hadn't called me in years. Even more surprising was that they were in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. When they walked into my apartment, their expressions were priceless. Mom's eyes darted from the panoramic windows to the designer furniture, while Dad stood awkwardly in the entrance as if afraid to touch anything. "This is quite impressive." Mom managed, running her finger along my marble kitchen counter. "You must be doing very well for yourself." "I am," I replied, simply offering them seats on my Italian leather sofa. They exchanged glances before Mom cleared her throat. "Well, we actually have some news. Grace is engaged to Thomas. They announced it last month at the engagement party." An engagement party I hadn't been invited to, of course. "They're planning the wedding for 6 months from now," Mom continued, her voice getting that familiar wheedling tone I remembered from childhood. "We've offered to pay half the expenses as is traditional." Dad shifted uncomfortably. "But it seems the total budget is, well, it's $300,000. I nearly choked on my water. $300,000? Thomas's family has certain expectations, Mom explained quickly. They're very prominent in the community. We announced we'd cover half before we knew the amount, and now. She trailed off, looking at me meaningfully. Now you need $150,000. I finished for her. Exactly. Mom brightened. And since you're doing so well, living in this beautiful apartment, working at such a prestigious firm, you want me to give you the money, I said flatly. Loan, Dad interjected. We're asking for a loan. We'll pay you back, of course. We'll even get it notarized. We know it's a lot, Mom said quickly, but we can't back out now. It would be so embarrassing with Thomas's family. They're expecting a certain standard. Like when I wanted to go to college? I interrupted. When I begged you for help. When I offered to sign a legal document promising to pay you back, Mom's face flushed. That was different. Different how? Because it was me asking? Because you told me you don't borrow money on principle? Stella, be reasonable, Dad started. Reasonable? I stood up. Like you were reasonable when you told me I wasn't college material? When you offered me a waitress job instead of helping me get an education? When you let Grandpa sell his property to help me, while you saved all your money for Grace? That's not fair, Mom protested. No, what's not fair is that you're only here because you need something from me. You didn't invite me to the engagement party. You haven't spoken to me in years, and now you want $150,000? I walked to the door and opened it. I don't loan money on principle. I believe that's a family tradition, isn't it? Mom's face turned red with anger. How dare you throw our words back at us? After everything we've done for you. Everything you've done for me? I laughed bitterly. Please leave now. They stormed out, Mom muttering about ingratitude and Dad avoiding eye contact. As I closed the door behind them, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up to them on my own terms, in my own home, from a position of strength. My phone rang again the next day. This time it was Grace. What is wrong with you? She didn't even bother with a hello. Mom told me what happened. How can you be so selfish? I sat back in my office chair, watching the sunset through my panoramic windows. Selfish? That's rich coming from you, Grace. We're family, Stella. Family helps each other. You have the money. Everyone knows you're doing well now. Why won't you help with my wedding? I could almost laugh at the absurdity. Family? Now suddenly I'm family? What about when I was visiting your house and you all called me a beggar? When you mocked where I lived? When you laughed at my job? Was I family then? That was different, Grace protested. We were just teasing. You're being ridiculous now. No, what's ridiculous is that none of you spoke to me for years until you needed something. If you need money so badly, why don't you ask our parents? They're your real family after all. They made that clear enough over the years, you bitter, ungrateful bitch. Grace exploded. You think you're so much better than us now with your fancy apartment and your big job? You're still the same pathetic little sister who was never good enough. The line went dead as she hung up. I sat there for a moment, surprised to find that her words didn't hurt anymore. They just made me tired. A week later, I was having Sunday dinner at my grandparents' house, a tradition I'd kept up ever since college. Grandma was unusually quiet as she served the pot roast. Your parents called us yesterday, Grandpa finally said, his voice heavy. I put down my fork. Let me guess. They asked for money for the wedding? Grandma nodded. They're getting desperate, I think. Your mother had quite a lot to say about family obligations. When we told them we're retired and don't have that kind of money, Grandpa continued, your mother had the nerve to suggest we sell something. She said, well, you sold the land for Stella's college, didn't you? She suggested we sell the car. The car I gave you? I was stunned. She actually suggested you sell your gift? That's when I hung up on her, Grandpa said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Told her that unlike some people, we don't sell gifts from family members who actually care about us. Grandma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The three of us sat there in understanding silence, bound together by something stronger than mere blood ties. Word travels fast in a small town, and my parents made sure it traveled even faster. Within weeks, their version of events had spread through our entire extended family and social circle. I started hearing snippets of their carefully crafted narrative from various sources. Did you hear about the younger daughter? My mother's friend loudly gossiped at the local grocery store, not realizing I was in the next aisle. Got some fancy job and now she thinks she's too good for her own family. Won't even speak to them anymore, says they're too poor for her now. At church, relatives would shoot disapproving glances my way when I visited with my grandparents. My Aunt Martha called one evening, heavy with judgment. Your mother told me you wouldn't even let her into your apartment when she came to visit. How could you treat your own mother that way? I could have corrected the record, could have told everyone how my parents had only reached out when they needed money, how they'd never supported my dreams, how they'd mocked and belittled me at every turn, but I'd learned long ago that trying to defend yourself against toxic people only gives them more ammunition. Instead, I focused on my work, spent time with my grandparents, and let the gossip swirl around me like autumn leaves in the wind. My grandparents knew the truth. They'd lived through every moment of it with me and that was enough. But with 2 weeks left before the wedding, Grace made one final attempt. She showed up at my apartment unannounced wearing her most expensive outfit and her most convincing smile. Stella, we need to talk, she said, brushing past me into the living room. This has gone on long enough. We're sisters, we shouldn't be fighting like this. I stood by the window, arms crossed, watching her settle herself on my sofa as if she owned it. Why are you really here, Grace? To make peace, she gave me her best pageant winner smile. And to help you understand the situation better. You see, Thomas's parents are not just rich, they're old money. They have connections everywhere. The wedding has to be perfect. I waited knowing there was more. The final payments are due next week, the restaurant deposit, the wedding planner's fee, the flowers. She twisted her engagement ring nervously. If Mom and Dad can't contribute their share, it's going to be so embarrassing. Thomas's parents will find out they couldn't afford it. It won't just reflect badly on Mom and Dad, it'll reflect on me. On my future with Thomas. So this visit isn't really about reconciling, it's about the money. No, well, yes, but, she stood up and walked over to me, placing her hand on my arm. Stella, please, you're my sister, I need your help. We need to make a great impression on Thomas's parents. I gently removed her hand, walked to the door and opened it. I don't care about impressing Thomas's parents, I don't care about your perfect wedding, and I definitely don't care what any of you think anymore. You're making a huge mistake, she said, her voice trembling with anger. You'll regret this. I smiled, feeling genuinely at peace. No, Grace. For the first time in my life, I'm absolutely certain I won't. A few days after Grace's visit, my phone lit up with a text from Sarah, her college friend who'd always been kind to me. She thought I should know what had happened at the country club the previous evening. Your parents finally had to come clean to Thomas's family, she wrote. They couldn't dodge the wedding planner's calls anymore. It was apparently quite a scene. I could picture it clearly. The elegant country club dining room, Thomas's wealthy parents in their designer clothes. The moment my parents had to admit they couldn't afford their share of the wedding expenses. According to Sarah, Thomas's mother had practically turned purple with rage. The carefully planned fairy tale wedding began to unravel. The honeymoon suite in the Maldives canceled. The vintage champagne orders scaled back. The designer flower arrangements simplified. Thomas's parents eventually agreed to cover all the expenses themselves, but the damage was done. The wedding did go forward, though scaled down from its original grandeur. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't expect to be. My grandparents received an invitation but declined to attend, sending a polite note about prior commitments. We spent that Saturday together instead, having a picnic in their backyard, steadfastly avoiding any mention of the event taking place across town. A week later, the wedding photos appeared on social media. I found myself scrolling through them one evening, wineglass in hand, studying the faces in each carefully staged shot. There was Grace in her designer gown. Thomas looked stiff and formal, his family arranged around him like expensive statues. And my parents, they were easy to spot in their new outfits, probably bought on credit, trying so hard to look like they belonged in this world of old money and country club memberships. But their smiles were strained, their poses awkward. Thomas's parents appeared in only a few photos, their expressions ranging from barely concealed disdain to outright displeasure. In one particularly telling shot, his mother was caught looking at my parents with the kind of expression usually reserved for something unpleasant found on the bottom of one's shoe. Sarah texted me updates occasionally in the weeks that followed. Grace and Thomas moved into a house his parents had bought them as a wedding gift. My parents rarely visited. Apparently they weren't quite what Thomas's family had envisioned for Sunday dinners. I haven't spoken to my parents or Grace since before the wedding. I doubt I ever will again, but sitting here in my apartment, watching the sunset paint the city sky in shades of gold, I finally feel at peace with that fact. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes.